The first time I realized my family had already decided my place in their lives, I was standing in my mother's kitchen, holding an envelope that wasn't meant for me. It had my brother's name on it. Not mine, not ours, just his. Inside was a copy of a revised will. My name wasn't there. My name is Hannah Rowe. I was 31 years old when I learned that the people who raised me had quietly planned a future where I no longer existed in any meaningful way. It wasn't a dramatic discovery. No shouting, no confrontation. My mother didn't even notice I was holding the envelope at first. She was busy wiping down the counter, the way she always did when she was nervous, even if she would never admit it. "You can just leave that there," she said casually, glancing over her shoulder. "That's for your brother." I looked down at the paper in my hands. The law firm's logo was embossed at the top, a name I recognized. The same firm that had handled my grandmother's estate years earlier. "I wasn't snooping," I said. My voice sounded calm, almost detached. "It was on the table." She shrugged. "Well, now you know it's not yours." That sentence landed heavier than she probably intended. Not yours. As if inheritance were a gift, not a lifetime of contribution. As if belonging were conditional. I placed the envelope back on the counter, exactly where I'd found it. I didn't open it further. I didn't ask questions. I already knew the answer. My older brother, Lucas, had always been the center of gravity in our family. The reliable one. The one who stayed close, took over my father's construction supply company after college, married early, gave my parents grandchildren on a predictable schedule. I was the other one. The daughter who moved away. The one who didn't marry by 25. The one who asked uncomfortable questions about finances and contracts and ownership, instead of just trusting that things would work out. I worked in corporate compliance for a regional manufacturing group in Chicago. I read contracts for a living. I found problems before they became lawsuits. I understood systems and incentives and how people behaved when they thought no one was watching. My family liked to say I was too serious. What they meant was that I didn't play along. I'd come home that weekend because my mother insisted. "Early Christmas," she'd said. "Your father's health hasn't been great. It would mean a lot." I believed her. Or maybe I wanted to. My father, Gerald Rowe, had built raw materials from a single warehouse into a regional supplier. Nothing glamorous, but steady, profitable. The kind of family business that paid for college educations, suburban homes, and the unspoken assumption that loyalty would always be rewarded. I'd worked there summers in college. Late nights, inventory audits, vendor negotiations. I knew the books better than Lucas ever had. But when I left for Chicago after graduation, my role quietly disappeared. Lucas stayed. Lucas inherited responsibility. Lucas inherited trust. And now, apparently, Lucas was inheriting everything else, too. That night at dinner, my parents talked about Lucas's upcoming vow renewal. 15 years married. Big celebration planned for spring. Destination venue in Arizona. Family only. "Of course you'll come," my mother said automatically, not looking at me. I nodded. "If I'm invited." The table went quiet for just a beat too long. Lucas laughed. "Don't be dramatic, Hannah." I smiled back. "I'm not, but I was watching." I watched how my father avoided my eyes, how my mother changed the subject, how Lucas's wife, Erin, kept her hand on his arm like a reminder of permanence. Later that night, as everyone slept, I stood alone in my childhood bedroom, scrolling through old emails on my phone. Messages from my father asking me to review contracts. Messages thanking me for catching errors that saved the company thousands. The last one was dated 4 years ago. After that, silence. The next morning, my mother asked me to drive her to the grocery store. In the car, she finally spoke. "You shouldn't take things so personally," she said, staring out the window. "I haven't," I replied. "Hannah," she sighed. "Lucas has more responsibility. It makes sense." "It makes sense," I repeated. "To remove me entirely?" She flinched. "You don't know that." "I know enough," I said. She didn't argue. That afternoon, as I packed my car to head back to Chicago, my father stood in the driveway with his hands in his pockets. "You're doing well," he said, like it was an afterthought. "I am," I agreed. "You don't need all this," he added vaguely. I met his eyes. "All of what?" He hesitated. "Recognition, control, the business." I nodded slowly. Then you won't mind if I stop being involved at all. Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of unease. We'll talk later, he said, but we didn't. I drove back to Chicago with a strange sense of clarity settling in my chest. Not anger, not grief, understanding. They hadn't forgotten me. They had excluded me, quietly, intentionally, confident I would accept it the way I always had. What they didn't realize was that exclusion has a way of sharpening your focus. And once you see the system clearly, you don't need to raise your voice to change it. You just need to know where the leverage is. I didn't confront anyone on the drive back to Chicago. That surprised me more than anything. In the past, I would have rehearsed conversations in my head, imagined explanations that might make them see me differently. But this time, something had shut off. Not emotionally, strategically. When people show you how they've categorized you, arguing doesn't change the category. It only confirms that you're still playing their game. The first thing I did when I got home was pull out a notebook, an actual paper one. No passwords, no cloud backups, just ink and quiet. On the first page, I wrote a single line, row family, timeline. Then I started listing moments I'd once dismissed as insignificant. The Thanksgiving dinner 5 years earlier, when my birthday passed without comment, even though it had been the day before. My mother's laugh when I mentioned it. Oh, honey, you know dates aren't my thing. The Christmas when Lucas received a framed stock certificate from the company, handed to him in front of everyone, while I was given a scarf and told, "You don't really need anything, do you?" The phone call 3 years ago, when my father asked for my help reviewing a supplier contract, then told me not to bother sending notes because Lucas already signed it. At the time, I'd felt embarrassed. Now, I felt informed. The next week at work, I did what I always did. I showed up early. I reviewed compliance reports. I sat in meetings where executives spoke confidently about controls that only existed on paper, and I listened. During a lunch break, I called my friend Marisol. She was an attorney who specialized in estate planning and trust disputes. We'd met years ago at a professional conference and stayed in loose contact. "I need a hypothetical," I told her. She laughed. "Those are never hypothetical." "If a family-owned company is tied to an estate plan," I said, "and one child is excluded without explanation, what usually drives that decision?" She didn't hesitate. Control. Or fear. Fear of what? Exposure, she said. Someone knowing too much. Someone asking questions. I looked down at my notes, and if the excluded child has previously handled contracts, audits, or financial reviews, Marisol exhaled slowly. Then the exclusion is rarely personal. It's preventative. That word stayed with me. Preventative. That night, I logged into an old external hard drive I hadn't touched in years. It contained backups from my time helping at Raw Materials. Spreadsheets, vendor lists, email chains. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I knew what I was no longer willing to ignore. 2 hours in, I noticed something small but off. A series of vendor payments routed through a subsidiary LLC I didn't recognize. The amounts weren't outrageous. They were steady, predictable. The LLC name rang faint bells. I remembered Lucas mentioning it once, casually, like it was nothing. I wrote the name down. The next morning, I searched public records. The LLC had been registered 18 months earlier. The listed address matched a commercial property owned by my parents personally, not by the company. That was unusual. Not illegal. Not necessarily, but unusual. I didn't tell anyone what I'd found. Not Marisol, not anyone at work. Instead, I waited. 2 weeks later, my mother called. "Hannah," she said, her voice bright in a way that felt forced. "We're finalizing plans for Lucas's vow renewal. We wanted to check your availability." I held the phone away from my ear for a second, then brought it back. "Am I invited?" I asked. There it was again. That pause. "Of course," she said quickly. "Why wouldn't you be?" I smiled to myself. "I'll let you know," I said. After we hung up, I added a new page to my notebook. Vow Renewal. Timing. That afternoon, I received an email from Lucas. Subject: quick question. "Hey, Han. Dad mentioned you've been busy lately. Everything okay? Just wanted to check in. Lucas." I read it twice. No mention of the will, no mention of the envelope. Just concern. Lightly performed. I replied with one sentence. "All good. just focusing on work. He didn't respond. That weekend, I visited my grandmother's old neighborhood on a whim. She'd passed away 6 years earlier, leaving most of her assets to my parents with a simple trust structure. She had been quiet, observant. She'd watched my family dynamics with a kind of sad patience. I remembered something she'd said once, when I was in college, and complaining about fairness. People don't always choose what's right, she'd told me. They choose what keeps them comfortable. At the time, I thought she meant emotionally. Now I understood she meant structurally. That evening, Marisol called me back unexpectedly. "I thought about your question," she said. "If you ever want to formally review an estate plan you're connected to, you have rights. Even if you're excluded." "Even if I'm not named?" I asked. "Especially then," she said. "Exclusion doesn't eliminate standing. Sometimes it creates it." I thanked her and hung up. For the first time since finding that envelope, I felt something like anticipation, not revenge, not anger, momentum. Because what my family didn't realize was that by quietly removing me, they'd freed me from the obligation to protect their version of the story. And once you're no longer trying to belong, you're finally able to see clearly. By the time March arrived, I understood one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever my family was hiding, they believed time was on their side. They thought distance would soften me, that silence would wear me down, that eventually I'd stop paying attention and go back to being the agreeable daughter who lived 2 states away and asked for nothing. That assumption was their first real mistake. I didn't rush. I didn't dig wildly. I let patterns repeat. Every Sunday evening, my mother posted photos on Facebook. Family dinners, Lucas and Aaron with the kids. My father smiling stiffly at the head of the table. Captions about gratitude and blessings, and how proud she was of the life they'd built. I was never tagged. At work, I kept my routine unchanged. But I started noticing something else. My manager, a woman named Denise who had built her career the hard way, began pulling me into higher-level conversations, compliance planning, risk mitigation, long-term exposure. One afternoon, after a meeting ran long, she closed the door behind us. "You have good instincts," she said. "You see what others gloss over." I nodded. "It's my job." "It's more than that," she replied. "Most people don't want to see problems until they explode." That night, I went home and opened my notebook again. I added a new heading. Instincts I ignored. Under it, I wrote my grandmother's name. She had never trusted my father's partner choices. Never trusted Lucas's impulsiveness. Never trusted the idea that family loyalty alone could replace oversight. When she died, I remembered my parents handling everything. The trust, the assets, the explanations. I hadn't asked questions then. I was grieving. I was younger. I assumed fairness was automatic. I knew better now. I called Marisol again. "I want to request a copy of my grandmother's trust documents," I said. There was a pause. "Do you have standing?" "I was her granddaughter," I said, "and I worked for the family business tied to her assets." "That may be enough," she said carefully. "But you should be prepared for resistance." "I am," I replied. The request went out the next morning. 3 days later, my father called for the first time since Christmas. "Hannah," he said, his voice strained but polite. "Why are lawyers asking about your grandmother's trust?" I didn't answer immediately. "Because I'm reviewing my records," I said. And I realized I never saw the final version. "There's nothing for you there," he said quickly. "That's interesting," I replied. "Because the firm didn't say that." Silence. "You're stirring things up," he said finally. "This isn't necessary." "Then it shouldn't be a problem," I said. He sighed. "We did what was best." "For who?" I asked. He didn't answer. After we hung up, I felt something tighten in my chest. Not fear. Recognition. People only get defensive when there's something to defend. The documents arrived the following week. I didn't open them right away. I waited until Saturday morning, made coffee, cleared my table, and read slowly. The trust was more complex than I remembered. Layered protections, contingency clauses, oversight triggers tied to misuse of assets connected to the family business. And then, I saw it. A clause amended 2 years before my grandmother's death. In the event of mismanagement by primary beneficiaries, the trustee was authorized to redirect certain holdings to an alternate beneficiary. The name was unmistakable. Hannah Rowe. Not as an heir, not as a primary beneficiary, as a contingency. My breath stayed steady. My hands didn't shake. They knew. They had known. All along. That explained the envelope, the secrecy, the sudden urgency to consolidate control under Lucas's name alone. I scanned the trustee information. A regional trust administration office in St. Louis. Independent, conservative, thorough. I took a photo of the page and saved it to a secure folder. That evening, Lucas called. "You've been asking questions," he said without preamble. "I've been answering my own," I replied. "You don't need to do this," he said. "Dad's under a lot of stress." "So am I said. "The difference is, I didn't create it." He scoffed. "You left. You walked away." "I stepped back," I corrected. "You pushed me out." "That's not fair." "Fair isn't relevant," I said. "Accurate is." He lowered his voice. "You're going to hurt people." "I'm not responsible for protecting lies," I replied. He hung up. That night I couldn't sleep. Not from anxiety, but from calculation. If my name was in the trust as a contingency, then my exclusion wasn't just emotional. It was strategic. They needed me uninvolved, uninformed, quiet, and they were accelerating something. The vow renewal, the consolidation of assets, the timing. I opened my notebook and wrote one final line at the bottom of the page. They are preparing. I didn't know exactly for what yet, but I knew one thing. Once people start moving this deliberately, they're either covering past actions or planning future ones. And either way, they don't expect to be challenged. Once I understood that my exclusion wasn't emotional but procedural, my perspective shifted. I stopped asking why. I started tracking how. The vow renewal was set for mid-May, a resort outside Sedona. Lucas and Aaron framed it as a celebration, but the logistics told a different story. Attorneys traveling with the family, a private meeting scheduled the morning after the ceremony. My mother mentioned, almost casually, that they were finally putting some long-term matters to rest. That phrase stayed with me. Long-term matters usually meant paperwork. I took a Friday off work and flew back east, not to see my parents, but to visit the trustee's regional office in St. Louis. I didn't announce myself. I didn't accuse. I requested information. The administrator I met with was a man in his early 50s named Robert Klein. He spoke slowly, carefully, like someone trained to never speculate. "You're listed as a contingent beneficiary," he confirmed. "That gives you limited rights to information, but not decision-making authority." "I understand," I said. "I'm not here to interfere. I want clarity." "About what?" "About whether any triggers have been activated," I replied. His eyes sharpened slightly. "What makes you ask that?" "Patterns," I said. "And timing." He didn't answer directly. Instead, he folded his hands. "There have been recent movements," he said. "Nothing actionable yet, but we're monitoring." Monitoring. That was enough. On the flight back, I replayed everything in my head. The LLC, the property address, the sudden emphasis on Lucas as sole decision-maker, the rush to formalize assets before something changed. They weren't just protecting control. They were trying to outrun oversight. The next escalation came sooner than I expected. 3 days later, I received an email from my father's attorney. Not a request, a notification. They were restructuring the company's ownership. Effective immediately. Lucas would assume full operational authority. Certain legacy agreements would be dissolved or reassigned. My name appeared once in the email. As a former consultant with no ongoing claims, it was clean, clinical, designed to close doors quietly. I forwarded the email to Marisol with a single line. "Is this standard?" Her response came fast. "No, this is defensive." That evening, my mother called. "Hannah, we're worried about you," she said. "I'm fine," I replied. "You've been distant," she continued. "And this legal stuff? It's unnecessary." "It's already happening," I said. "I didn't start it." She hesitated. "We're doing this to protect the family." "From what?" I asked. Silence. "From uncertainty," she finally said. I leaned back in my chair. "Uncertainty for who?" "For everyone," she said quickly. "No," I replied. "For the people in control." Her voice hardened. "You're overthinking this." I smiled faintly. "You taught me to think." After we hung up, I opened my notebook again. New heading. Points of no return. I listed them carefully. Removal from will. Consolidation of authority. Legal notifications without discussion. acceleration of family events. Each one alone could be explained away. Together, they formed a pattern. The next morning at work, Denise asked me into her office again. "We're opening a senior compliance role," she said. "More authority, more autonomy." I raised an eyebrow. "You're offering me more responsibility while my family removes mine." She smiled slightly. "I'm offering you alignment." I accepted the interview. That weekend, I finally responded to my mother's vow renewal invitation. "I will attend." The reply came within minutes. "We're so glad." I wasn't. But attendance wasn't about celebration. It was about proximity. Because if they were planning to finalize something, I needed to see what they thought I wasn't watching. And because sometimes the most dangerous move you can make in a controlled system is simply showing up, calm, informed, and unafraid. They believed the ceremony marked closure. For me, it marked exposure. I arrived in Sedona 2 days before the vow renewal, not because I wanted extra time with my family, but because I wanted to see how they moved when they thought the outcome was already decided. The resort was isolated in the way expensive places often are. Red rock cliffs, gated entrances, discreet staff trained not to ask questions. Everything about it suggested privacy, permanence, and control. Lucas greeted me in the lobby with a wide smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Look who made it," he said, pulling me into a quick hug that felt more performative than affectionate. "Didn't think you'd come." "I said I would," I replied. He laughed. "You always were predictable that way." I noted that. Erin appeared a moment later, perfectly styled, her expression warm but guarded. "It's good to see you," she said. "The kids are excited you're here." I nodded. "I'll say hi later." What struck me immediately was how busy everyone seemed. Phones buzzing, quiet conversations breaking off when I approached. My father kept disappearing into side rooms with the attorney I recognized from the emails. They weren't celebrating, they were coordinating. That evening, we gathered for a small family dinner. No speeches, no toasts, just food and controlled conversation. At one point, my father leaned over and asked casually, "How's work in Chicago?" "Good," I said. "I'm moving into a senior compliance role." He blinked. "That's good." "Congratulations," my mother added, though her voice carried an odd tension. Lucas changed the subject immediately, launching into a story about expansion plans and vendor negotiations. He spoke confidently, using language I recognized from boardrooms, not because he understood it, but because he'd memorized it. I listened, quietly. Later that night, as I walked back to my room, I saw the attorney step out onto the terrace with my father. I slowed my pace, just enough to overhear fragments. "Trust administrator. Final signatures tomorrow. Once it's done, there's no reopening." I kept walking. The next morning, I requested a copy of the day's itinerary from the concierge. There it was. Private family meeting, 11 a.m., conference room C, scheduled for the morning after the ceremony. I took a photo and sent it to Marisol. "They're finalizing something." Her response came quickly. "Be careful and document everything." At breakfast, my mother sat beside me, her tone suddenly gentle. "You seem different," she said. "Calmer." "I am," I replied. "That's good," she said, almost relieved. "This family needs peace." I looked at her. "Peace for who?" She smiled tightly. "Everyone." I didn't press. The ceremony itself was flawless. Perfect lighting, soft music, carefully curated vows about renewal and commitment and choosing each other again. People cried, applauded, took photos. I clapped politely. Because while they were renewing promises, I was watching the exits. At the reception, Lucas pulled me aside. "Let's take a walk," he said. We stepped away from the crowd, out toward a quiet path lined with lanterns. "You've been quiet," he said. "I'm observing," I replied. He smirked. "Always analyzing." "Always," I agreed. He stopped walking and turned to face me. "You don't need to worry," he said. "Everything's handled. Dad's making sure things are secure." "Secure for who?" I asked. He hesitated, just a beat too long. "For the family," he said. I nodded slowly. "That's interesting." His expression tightened. "What do you mean?" I said, "families usually talk before they finalize things." He scoffed. "You left. You opted out." "No," I said calmly. "I was excluded." "That's not the same thing." "It is legally," I replied. His jaw clenched. You think you're smarter than us. I think I pay attention, I said. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. Don't do this. Not now. I met his gaze. Do what? Disrupt things, he said. We're finally getting things in order. I smiled faintly. Order for you isn't always justice. He shook his head. You don't understand what's at stake. I understand leverage, I replied, and timing. He stared at me, unsettled. That night, in my room, I made 2 calls. The first was to Marisol. They're finalizing tomorrow, I said. I need to know what my next step is. If they're triggering trust actions without disclosure, she said, you can formally notify the trustee. That pauses everything. And escalates, I said. Yes, she replied. Are you ready for that? I looked out at the dark desert sky. I am. The second call was to the trust administrator's office. I left a message requesting an urgent callback the next morning. I slept better than I had in months. Because the difference between fear and resolve is preparation. And I was prepared. Tomorrow, they believed they would secure the future. Tomorrow, I would remind them that control doesn't belong to the loudest voice in the room. It belongs to the one who understands the rules. The morning after the vow renewal dawned clear and cool, the kind of desert morning that feels ceremonial all on its own. From my balcony, I could see the red rocks catching the first light, solid and unmoved by whatever plans people made beneath them. I dressed simply. No jewelry, no bright colors. I wanted nothing about me to read as emotional or reactive, just present. At 8:12 a.m., my phone rang. Robert Klein, the trust administrator. Ms. Rowe, he said, his voice measured. You left a message requesting an urgent callback. Yes, I said. Thank you for returning it. We've received notice of a scheduled meeting involving the primary beneficiaries, he continued. We were not informed in advance. That doesn't surprise me, I replied. There was a pause. Do you have reason to believe trust-related actions are being taken? Yes, I said, and I believe they involve consolidation of control without full disclosure. Silence again. Then, if that's the case, you may submit a formal notice of concern. That will require us to pause any actions until review. I'd like to do that, I said. Understood, he replied. Send documentation immediately. I ended the call and sat very still for a moment. This was the point of no return. At 9:03 a.m., I emailed Robert the documents I had prepared weeks earlier. The amended trust clause, the LLC records, the property address, the attorney emails, the itinerary showing the private meeting scheduled for that morning. I kept my message short. Please consider this formal notice of concern regarding potential misuse and non-disclosure tied to trust-related assets. I sent it, closed my laptop, and exhaled. At 10:45 a.m., my phone buzzed. Lucas, where are you? I didn't respond. At 10:58, my mother called. Hannah, she said, her voice strained. Are you coming to the meeting? What meeting? I asked evenly. She hesitated. The family meeting. I wasn't invited, I replied. That's not true, she said quickly. We just assumed you'd come. I don't assume anymore, I said. At exactly 11 a.m., I walked past conference room C. The door was closed. Inside, I could hear muffled voices. My father's low and authoritative. Lucas's sharper, impatient. The attorney's calm, practiced tone. I kept walking. At 11:17 a.m., the door opened abruptly. The attorney stepped out first, phone already pressed to his ear. His expression had changed. Gone was the controlled confidence. In its place was irritation edged with concern. My father followed, his face flushed. He saw me immediately. Hannah, he said sharply, what did you do? I stopped walking. I exercised my rights, I said. You contacted the trustee, he snapped. Yes, I replied. Because you didn't. Lucas came out next, eyes blazing. You had no right, he said. I looked at him calmly. I had standing. This was supposed to be finalized today, my father said, his voice rising. Then you should have been transparent, I replied. The attorney ended his call and turned to us. We need to pause, he said to my father. The trust administrator has issued a temporary hold pending review. My mother appeared in the doorway, confusion written across her face. What does that mean? She asked. It means, the attorney said carefully, that nothing moves forward until questions are resolved. My father turned back to me. You're blowing this out of proportion, he said. This is family business. No, I replied. This is fiduciary duty. Lucas stepped closer, lowering his voice. You're doing this to punish us, he said. I shook my head. I'm doing this to stop pretending. The silence that followed was thick, uncomfortable. People passing in the hallway slowed, sensing tension. A staff member glanced over, then looked away. Let's talk privately, my mother said quickly. I'm done with private conversations, I said. They're how this happened. My father's shoulders sagged slightly. For the first time, he looked tired rather than angry. What do you want? He asked. There it was again, that question. I want accountability, I said, and separation. Separation from what? My mother asked. From control, I replied. From being managed out of my own family. Lucas laughed bitterly. You think you can just rewrite everything? I'm not rewriting, I said. I'm enforcing what already exists. The attorney cleared his throat. I strongly recommend cooperation, he said to my father. If the administrator escalates this to a formal audit, exposure increases. My father closed his eyes. How long? He asked. Weeks, the attorney replied. Possibly months. Lucas swore under his breath. I looked at all of them then. My parents, my brother. People who had once assumed my silence meant consent. This didn't have to be public, my mother said softly. It still isn't, I replied. Unless you make it so. I turned and walked away before anyone could say anything else. Back in my room, my phone buzzed again. A new email from Robert Klein. We have initiated a preliminary review. All trust-related actions are paused effective immediately. We will be in contact to schedule formal interviews. I sat on the edge of the bed, steady. No rush of triumph. No collapse of emotion, just alignment. That afternoon, I checked out of the resort early. As I drove away, red rocks shrinking in my rearview mirror, I realized something important. They thought the ceremony marked renewal. For me, it marked exposure. Because the moment you stop trying to be chosen, you become impossible to ignore. And once you've interrupted the system that depends on your silence, it can never return to what it was. Tomorrow, they would start negotiating. Not because they cared about me, but because they finally understood I wasn't powerless. The negotiations didn't begin right away. That was another mistake on their part. They assumed shock would wear off into compliance, that a few days of silence would make me nervous enough to reach out first. My family had always believed that withholding attention was a form of discipline. What they didn't understand was that I'd already lived without it. 2 days after I returned to Chicago, Robert Klein emailed me to schedule a formal interview. Not a conversation, an interview. The language mattered. I forwarded the email to Marisol and booked a conference room at my office for the call. Neutral ground. Recorded. Documented. At the same time, Denise stopped by my desk. I heard you're flying under the radar at home, she said lightly. If you need flexibility this week, take it. I looked up at her. Thank you. She paused. You know, she added, people who create stability don't need to announce it. They just build it. I understood then why she trusted me. The interview with the trust administrator lasted 90 minutes. Robert was calm but thorough. He asked about my role in the family business, my knowledge of asset structures, the timing of my exclusion, the LLC, the property address, the sudden consolidation of authority. I answered without embellishment. When I didn't know something, I said so. When I did, I referenced documents. At the end, he leaned back slightly. You understand, he said, that this review may trigger corrective action. Yes, I replied, and that it may strain family relationships. That happened before this call, I said. He nodded once. We'll be in touch. 3 hours later, my father called. I let it go to voicemail. He didn't leave a message. Lucas texted next. This is getting out of control. I typed a response, then deleted it. Control was the wrong word. What was happening was correction. That evening, Marisol called. They're nervous, she said. Your father's attorney reached out to mine. They want to discuss options. Options for who? I asked. For damage control, she replied. They're floating the idea of a settlement. I leaned back in my chair. I'm listening, I said, but I'm not negotiating emotionally. Good, she said, because this isn't about reconciliation. It's about structure. The proposed call happened 2 days later. My father's attorney, Marisol, me, no Lucas. No my mother. That absence told me everything. They're willing to formalize separation, the attorney said, from the company and from future claims. And the trust? Marisol asked. The attorney hesitated. That's more complicated. It always is, I said. We're prepared to acknowledge Hannah's contingent status in writing, he continued, and to establish independent oversight of raw materials. In exchange for what? Marisol asked. A release of future claims, he said. I smiled slightly. No, I said. The line went quiet. That's not reasonable, the attorney replied. It's precise, I said. If I release future claims, I lose protection. If oversight is necessary now, it will remain necessary. You're being inflexible, he said. I'm being accurate, I replied. After the call ended, Marisol exhaled. You just shifted the leverage, she said. I know, I replied. That night, Emily texted me. Can we talk? I stared at the message for a long moment before replying. Tomorrow. We met at a coffee shop halfway between our apartments. She looked tired. Not the curated exhaustion of social media, but the real kind that comes from having to rethink your assumptions. They're furious, she said quietly. Dad won't stop pacing. Lucas keeps saying you plan this. I stirred my coffee. Did I plan to be excluded? She flinched. No. Then this is the result, I said. She wrapped her hands around her cup. They say you're trying to tear the family apart. I'm trying to stop holding it together alone, I replied. She was quiet for a moment. I didn't know about the trust, she admitted, or the LLC. I know, I said. And I didn't question why you stopped being included, she said, her voice breaking slightly. I just accepted it. That's how systems survive, I replied. By making exclusion feel normal. She nodded slowly. What happens now? She asked. I met her eyes. Now they have to explain their choices to people who don't accept because we said so as an answer. The next morning, Robert Klein emailed again. Based on preliminary findings, we are expanding the scope of review to include asset transfers connected to raw materials. Please preserve all relevant documentation. I forwarded it to Marisol. Then I sat, very still. This was the point where everything changed. Not loudly, not publicly, but irreversibly. Because once oversight enters a system built on silence and favoritism, the tables don't flip all at once. They tilt slowly, precisely. And everyone who assumed gravity was on their side suddenly has to learn how to stand again. The expansion of the review didn't make headlines. That was intentional. Oversight, when done correctly, doesn't arrive with sirens. It arrives with emails, deadlines, and the quiet authority of people who don't need permission to ask questions. Robert Klein scheduled follow-up interviews, not just with me, but with my father, Lucas, and the company's outside accountant. Requests for documents went out. Bank statements, operating agreements, internal approvals. The machinery was moving. My family responded the only way they knew how, by closing ranks. My mother stopped calling entirely. Lucas blocked me on social media. Erin posted vague quotes about loyalty and betrayal that her friends eagerly interpreted in the comments. I watched, without reacting. At work, my interview for the senior compliance role turned into an offer. Denise called me into her office late Friday afternoon. It's yours if you want it, she said. More authority. Direct reporting line to the board. I nodded. I want it. She smiled. Good. You don't flinch when things get uncomfortable. That night, my father showed up at my apartment. No call. No warning. I opened the door and found him standing there, coat still on, eyes rimmed with exhaustion. Hannah, he said. We need to talk. I stepped aside and let him in. He didn't sit. He paced the small living room, hands clasped behind his back, like he was still in charge of something. You forced our hand, he said. I didn't force anything, I replied. I responded. He stopped pacing. You know what this is doing to us. Yes, I said. I do. You could have come to me, he said. Privately. I tried. He shook his head. This review could damage the company. The company should withstand scrutiny, I said. If it can't, that's not my fault. His voice rose. You don't understand how fragile things are. I met it. He looked away. For a moment, he seemed smaller, not weaker, just human. You were trying to control it, I replied. There's a difference. He sighed heavily. What do you want? There it was again. I want. And after that? He asked. After that, I said. What happens to you isn't my responsibility. He closed his eyes briefly, then nodded. I'll speak to the attorney, he said. That stung, I could tell. He left without another word. 2 days later, Marisol called. "They're ready to concede oversight," she said. "And they'll formally acknowledge your contingent status." "And the release?" I asked. "They still want it," she said. "And my answer is still no," I replied. She smiled audibly through the phone. Good. The trust administrator scheduled a joint call. Not a family meeting, a procedural one. When the call began, everyone was present. My father, Lucas, their attorney, the outside accountant, Robert Klein, Marisol, and me. Robert spoke first. "Our review indicates governance concerns," he said evenly, "specifically related to asset transfers and decision-making authority." Lucas interrupted. "There was no intent to misuse anything." Robert didn't react. "Intent is not the standard. Duty is." Silence. "We will be imposing independent oversight," Robert continued, "and certain authorities will be limited pending further review." My father inhaled sharply. "And Ms. Rowe?" the attorney asked. "What is her role in this going forward?" Robert turned to me. "That is for Ms. Rowe to decide." I felt every pair of eyes on me. "I will not be involved operationally," I said. "I will not advise, consult, or shield." "And claims?" the attorney pressed. "I reserve my rights," I replied calmly. The call ended without resolution on that point, but something had shifted. Afterward, Lucas texted me for the first time in weeks. "You've made yourself an enemy." I stared at the message, then replied with one sentence. "I stopped making myself convenient." That evening, Emily called. "They're saying you've changed," she said quietly. "I have," I replied. "They don't recognize you." "That's not my problem," I said. She hesitated. "I'm starting to." A week later, the first formal findings arrived. Not accusations, findings. Inconsistent approvals. Blurred boundaries. Concentration of authority without adequate oversight. The language was restrained. The implications were not. My father stepped down from daily operations. Lucas was required to share authority with an external manager. Raw materials didn't collapse. It adjusted. That was the most unsettling part for them. The world didn't end. It corrected. And I wasn't at the center of it anymore. One night, as I sat alone in my apartment, I realized something I hadn't expected. I didn't feel victorious. I felt finished. Finished explaining. Finished hoping. Finished negotiating my place in a system that required my silence to function. Because the most profound shift hadn't happened in a boardroom or a legal call. It had happened quietly, the moment I stopped asking to be included and started insisting on clarity. And once clarity enters a family built on control, nothing ever feels the same again. The hardest part came after the decisions were made, not during the calls, not during the documents or the findings, or the careful language that turned years of behavior into neutral phrases, like governance concerns and inconsistent approvals. The hardest part was the quiet that followed. No more emergencies, no more urgent emails, no more dramatic pauses filled with expectation, just space. And space has a way of revealing what was always there. Raw materials adjusted quickly under external management. That was another thing my family hadn't expected. They'd believed the company depended on them, on my father's presence, on Lucas's authority. Instead, the systems I'd helped build years earlier did exactly what they were designed to do. They held. Employees adapted. Vendors complied. The world moved on. My father stopped calling entirely. Not even to argue. Not even to ask what I wanted now. The man who once filled every room with certainty had gone silent, and that silence felt deliberate. Lucas resurfaced once, indirectly. I found out through Emily. "They're selling the lake house," she said when we met for lunch. "Dad says it's temporary. Cash flow." I nodded. "It makes sense." She studied me. "You sound like an advisor." "I'm not," I said. "I just understand consequences." She stirred her soup without eating it. "He keeps saying you did this." "I didn't," I replied. I refused to stop it. That distinction mattered to me more than it ever would to him. A week later, Marisol called with an update. "They're pushing again for a release," she said. "They want closure." "They want insulation," I replied. "Yes," she agreed. "Same thing to them." "What happens if I refuse?" I asked. "They live with uncertainty," she said, "which they hate." I smiled faintly. Then we're aligned. At work, my new role settled into place. Board meetings, risk assessments, strategic reviews. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was trusted by strangers with far more than my own family had ever entrusted me with. One afternoon, Denise pulled me aside. "You know," she said, "people who come from controlling environments tend to either replicate them or dismantle them." "Which one do you think I'm doing?" I asked. She smiled. "You're building something cleaner." That night, my mother emailed me. Not a long message, not an apology, just a question. "Do you ever miss us?" I stared at the screen for a long time before responding. "I miss who I thought we were." She didn't reply. 2 days later, I received notice that the trust administrator had concluded the active phase of the review. Oversight would remain in place. My contingent status was reaffirmed in writing. No further action was required unless new issues arose. It was over. Officially. Emotionally, it had ended much earlier. Emily came over that weekend. She looked different, less polished, more present. "I moved out," she said quietly. "Just for now." I nodded. "How does that feel?" "Like breathing," she admitted. "And also like failure." "It's not failure," I said. "It's information." She smiled weakly. "You always say things like that." "I mean them," I replied. She hesitated, then asked, "Do you hate them?" I considered the question carefully. "No," I said. "I understand them." "And that's better?" "It's quieter," I said. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner." "I know," I said. And I meant it. That night, after she left, I opened my notebook one last time. The pages were full now. Dates, names, patterns, conclusions. I didn't need it anymore. I closed it and placed it in a box in the back of my closet. Not because I wanted to forget, but because I no longer needed reminders to stay awake. The following month, Lucas sent me an email. No subject line. "I hear you're doing well." I read it once. Then I archived it. Because success doesn't require acknowledgement from the people who withheld it in the first place. What I felt now wasn't triumph, it was separation. The clean kind. The kind that leaves space for new definitions. Family, I realized, wasn't about proximity or shared names or even shared history. It was about mutual accountability. And once you see how rare that is, you stop chasing it where it doesn't exist. As I prepared for bed that night, my phone buzzed again. A new email from the trust administrator. "There is one additional matter we need to discuss. Please call when available." I sat down slowly on the edge of the bed. Just when I thought the chapter was closing, another page was turning, and something told me this wasn't about my parents. It was about something they hadn't told me. Something older. Something buried. I didn't call back that night. Not because I was afraid of what Robert Klein might say, but because I'd learned the value of letting information wait. Urgency was a tool my family used to control outcomes. I no longer reacted to it. I slept. The next morning, I called Robert from my office before anyone else arrived. "Thank you for getting back to me," he said. "I didn't want to put details in writing yet." "I understand," I replied. "What's the matter?" He paused, just long enough to signal wait. "During the review," he said, "we revisited your grandmother's original trust file. Not just the amendments, the full archive." My posture straightened. "There was a document," he continued, "that was referenced but never formally distributed to beneficiaries." "What kind of document?" I asked. "A memorandum of intent," he said. "Not legally binding on its own, but relevant." Relevant was his way of saying disruptive. "It outlines your grandmother's concerns," he said carefully, "specifically about succession and concentration of control." I closed my eyes. "She believed the business should never be fully controlled by a single child," he continued. "And she expressed concern about Lucas's judgment." I didn't feel vindicated. I felt confirmed. "She also mentioned you," he added. I waited. "She noted that you had a temperament suited to oversight rather than expansion." Her words. That sounded exactly like her. "Why wasn't this shared?" I asked. "It appears your father requested it remain internal," Robert said. "At the time, there was no formal challenge." "And now?" I asked. "Now," he replied, "it contextualizes the contingency clause." I leaned back in my chair, steady. "Are there implications?" I asked. "Yes," he said. "It strengthens your standing. And it raises questions about disclosure." When the call ended, I didn't move for a long time. So this was the hidden truth. Not a secret account. Not a surprise asset. Intent. My grandmother had seen this coming. She had tried, in her quiet way, to correct the future. And my father had buried her voice because it threatened his version of order. That afternoon, Marisol came to my office. She read the memorandum twice. "This changes leverage," she said finally. "Significantly." "I don't want leverage," I said. "I want closure." She looked at me. "Sometimes closure requires documentation." That evening, my father called. I answered. "Hannah," he said, his voice cautious. "I heard you spoke with the trustee." "Yes," I replied. "There's talk of old documents," he said. "Yes," I said, again. He exhaled. "Your grandmother worried too much." "She worried accurately," I replied. Silence stretched between us. "You're reopening things that don't need reopening," he said. "No," I said. "I'm acknowledging things that were ignored." He lowered his voice. "What do you want now?" I chose my words carefully. "I want the memorandum disclosed formally," I said, "and attached to the trust record." "That would embarrass me," he said flatly. "It would clarify responsibility," I replied. He didn't argue. He just ended the call. 2 days later, the trust administrator issued an addendum. The memorandum was formally recorded. Not public, but official. My phone buzzed with messages from family members I hadn't heard from in years. Aunts, cousins, people suddenly curious. I didn't respond, because the story they wanted wasn't mine to manage. Emily called that night. "They're shaken," she said. "Dad especially." "I know," I replied. "He keeps saying Grandma turned you against him." I smiled sadly. "She didn't turn me against him. She saw me." That was the difference. The following week, my father's attorney sent a revised proposal. No release, formal separation, acknowledgement of intent, no further contact unless initiated by both parties. I signed. Not because I was winning, but because I was done. When the final documents were executed, nothing dramatic happened. No apology, no reconciliation, just quiet compliance. That night, I walked through my apartment, touching familiar objects. The bookshelf, the window, the small table where I'd written notes late into the night. This was the life I'd built, without permission. And now, for the first time, it felt entirely mine. I understood then that revenge doesn't always look like punishment. Sometimes it looks like truth, placed permanently where it can no longer be erased. And that kind of truth doesn't need an audience. It just needs to exist. After the documents were signed and recorded, the noise faded faster than I expected. No more attorneys CC'd on emails. No more sudden calls from unfamiliar numbers. No more carefully worded messages pretending to check on my well-being while fishing for leverage. What remained was absence. And absence, when you've lived inside control for most of your life, can feel disorienting at first. I noticed it on the Sunday morning while making coffee. There was no background anxiety, no anticipation of interruption, no sense that I needed to be available in case someone decided my silence meant rebellion. I stood there longer than necessary, just noticing the quiet. At work, the board approved a new compliance framework I designed. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't personal. It was clean, transparent, boring in the best possible way. Denise stopped by my office afterward. "You realize," she said, leaning against the door frame, "you just did something most people spend years avoiding." "What's that?" I asked. "You made accountability non-negotiable," she said, "and you didn't apologize for it." I smiled. I'm done apologizing for clarity. That week, I received a handwritten note from the trust administrator. Not an email, an actual card. "Ms. Rowe, your cooperation and professionalism throughout this process were noted. Your grandmother would have approved of the outcome. Respectfully, R. Klein." I folded it once and placed it in the same drawer as my grandmother's letter. Not because I needed reminders, because I wanted continuity. Emily and I met again, this time at my place. She looked around slowly, taking in the small details. "It feels like you," she said. Calm, intentional. "I had to unlearn chaos," I replied. She nodded. "I think I'm starting to." She hesitated, then asked, "Do you think they'll ever admit it?" I considered the question. "No," I said. "Not in the way you mean." "But they know," she said. "Yes," I replied. "And that's enough." She sat back on the couch, thoughtful. "Dad told me something strange," she said after a moment. "He said losing control felt worse than losing money." "That doesn't surprise me," I said. She looked at me. How did you stop wanting them to see you? I answered honestly. I didn't stop wanting it, I said. I stopped organizing my life around it. That seemed to settle something in her. A few days later, Lucas emailed me again. Longer this time. Defensive. Carefully phrased. Full of explanations that came years too late. He wrote about pressure, expectations, the weight of carrying the family legacy alone. He never once acknowledged the exclusion. I read it once. Then I archived it. Not because it didn't matter, but because it didn't change anything. The truth had already been recorded. One evening, I visited my grandmother's old house. It had been sold years earlier, but I parked across the street and sat in my car, watching the lights in the windows. She taught me more through restraint than anyone else ever had. She hadn't confronted my father loudly. She hadn't dismantled the system herself. She'd simply left evidence. She trusted time to do what argument never could. I understood her now. On the anniversary of the vow renewal, my mother sent me a message. I hope you're well. I stared at it for a long time before responding. I am. Nothing more. Nothing less. That night, I wrote the last entry in my notebook. Not a timeline. Not a strategy. Just one sentence. Control depends on silence. Integrity does not. I closed the notebook and put it away for good, because I wasn't carrying this story anymore. I had lived it. The next chapter of my life didn't need opposition to define it. It needed boundaries. And those, once set, didn't require maintenance. They simply existed. The first holiday season after everything ended didn't feel empty. It felt quiet, in a way I had never experienced before. No group texts coordinating appearances. No subtle reminders about what to say, how to behave, when to arrive. No unspoken expectation that I would smooth over tension just by being agreeable. On Thanksgiving morning, I cooked for myself. Not a full spread, just enough. A small turkey breast, roasted vegetables, a pie I didn't rush through. I ate slowly at my own table, sunlight coming in through the window, and realized something that surprised me. I wasn't lonely. I had been lonely inside my family for years. This was different. In December, Row Materials finalized its restructuring. My father remained a shareholder, but without operational authority. Lucas stayed on under supervision. His role narrowed, his decisions reviewed. The company didn't fail. It didn't implode. It stabilized. That was the final irony. All that control, all that exclusion, all that fear of losing power. And the business survived just fine once the noise was removed. I received one last formal notice from the trust administrator. Everything complete. Oversight in place. Records closed unless future violations occurred. No further action required. That sentence felt like a door, closing gently but firmly. Emily and I kept in touch. Not frequently, not out of obligation. Just enough to know the other existed beyond the family narrative we'd been raised in. She sent me a photo on Christmas Eve. A small tree in her apartment. No decorations, just lights. Trying something new, she wrote. I smiled and replied, "Looks peaceful." It was. My father never contacted me again. Neither did my mother, beyond occasional neutral messages that said nothing and asked nothing. And for the first time, I didn't interpret their silence as punishment. It was simply the result of boundaries they couldn't cross anymore. At work, I was asked to mentor a younger analyst. She was sharp, hesitant, clearly used to second-guessing herself. One afternoon, after a long meeting, she lingered at my door. "How do you know when to push back?" she asked. I thought about it. "When the cost of staying quiet becomes higher than the cost of being clear," I said. She nodded slowly, like she'd been waiting to hear that. That night, alone in my apartment, I opened the drawer where I kept my grandmother's letter and the administrator's note. I didn't reread them. I just held them for a moment, then placed them back. They had served their purpose. I understood now that revenge doesn't always involve confrontation or humiliation. Sometimes it looks like refusing to participate in a system that only works when you give up your agency. Sometimes it looks like documentation instead of arguments. Distance instead of explanations, choosing stability over approval. I hadn't won because my family lost. I had won because I stopped losing myself. If you're listening to this and you recognize the pattern, the favoritism, the manipulation, the quiet exclusion dressed up as family tradition, I want you to know something important. You don't have to burn everything down to take your power back. You don't have to convince anyone who benefits from misunderstanding you. You don't even have to be angry. You just have to be clear. Clear about your boundaries. Clear about your worth. Clear about what you will and will not accept. Because the moment you stop negotiating your dignity, the balance shifts. Not loudly, but permanently. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever been excluded, sidelined, or quietly erased by people who claim to love you? What did choosing yourself look like in your life? And if you want more stories about family drama, betrayal, and quiet revenge where the tables turn without shouting, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay with me. Thank you for listening.